All right, all right. Happy Thursday, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Sabs podcast. I'm your host, Sabrina My special guests tonight are Director John Kirby and producer Libby Handros. They have created the documentary called Four Died Trying. Thank you both so much for coming on.
Thanks for having us.
Pleasure. Thank you.
So I guess the first question I want to ask both of you, I want to go ahead and show the graphic here so people have an idea what this documentary is about. Four Died Trying is about JFK, Malcolm X, MLK, and Bobby Kennedy. It says they fought for peace, they fought for justice, they fought for freedom, they had to go. So I guess the first question that I want to ask you is, why did you decide to create a documentary about these figures here?
John, why don't you go for that one?
Well, actually, the original impetus came from our executive producer, who had the notion, what do the children of the major assassinated figures of the 1960s think about what happened to their fathers? And actually, at first, it was going to be John Lennon, and we, in dealing with our good friend, the writer Jim Douglas, ended up realizing that we had to, of course, include Malcolm. And so Libby and I have been working on a version of this film for even years before this. We were working on a film called The War on Us, U.S, about the way in which, call it state corporate forces have the people under a form of, constant attack. So this is something this is a subject that's been near and dear to us for a long time. When we were approached with the idea, we immediately thought it was a great one, and the idea expanded because we realized we had to speak not just to the children, but to surviving witnesses, colleagues, friends, even the enemies of these four men, as much as we possibly could. So we've, over the course of 8 years now, gathered over 130 interviews, some of them the final interviews that people gave. So, for instance, Dick Gregory probably gave us his last interview. The comedian and activist Mort Saul gave us his last interview. Numerous witnesses, colleagues and friends. The great RFK speechwriter Adam Walensky just passed. We probably have his last interview. So we were very fortunate we knew we had to, make use of the time and the funds that we had to get as many of these interviews as we could. And a picture has emerged of all four of these men really in direct confrontation with the powers that be. And that was, it's quite a remarkable story once you get into it.
Yes. And Libby, I want to go to you for the next question here, because what was really interesting to me, I'm thinking about the Vietnam War with all four of these figures, and JFK, or excuse me, actually let's start with Malcolm X. Malcolm X and MLK were very much against the war in Vietnam, and they did speak out against it. Do you think it was, based on the interviews that you have conducted for this documentary, do you think it was that particular war, speaking out against that particular conflict, that ultimately led to their demise?
It certainly helped. And I would add that JFK was going to not expand the war and get us out of the war. And certainly Bobby ran on a platform of ending the war. So all four men were against the war in Vietnam. Malcolm perhaps came out the earliest against it. And I would say, yes, their stance on the war definitely helped lead to their assassinations. And also in general, their whole vision for peace. Being for peace is not good for one's longevity if you're going to be a leader on the world stage. The industrial military complex doesn't like that, and they're going to do a lot to make sure you don't get to live a long and happy, fruitful life. And I should just add another thing, by the way, this isn't just a freestanding documentary. The prologue is the first of many films this is a film series, not just one documentary.
Right. It's also interesting to me, too, when we think about what's happening right now with Gaza. So there was a statement recently from Bernie Sanders that said that Gaza is Joe Biden's Vietnam. right? So if we're thinking back to who was in office during that time, which was LBJ, it's interesting that this documentary is coming out around this particular time. I don't know if that was intentional or not from either of you, or just the stars just happened to align, because there's been a lot of talk about ending the wars over the past, I would say, couple of years, but more so this year and last year. There have been a lot of politicians that have been speaking out against imperialism abroad. And I'm curious, when you look back to these four figures, and I want to put this back up on the screen for those who are just joining. When you look back on JFK, Malcolm X, MLK, and Bobby Kennedy, if they were alive today, where do you think they would stand in reference to the conflict that's happening in Gaza right now?
We wouldn't have it. It would never have happened in the first place. The world would be an incredibly different place if these four men had lived. We would not have had the war in Vietnam, which ruined the country. And from there, so many other things would have been possible. So it's almost, we wouldn't be in this situation, but I'll let John take it from there.
Well, I was going to say, so many things. I mean, think about our position with Russia, right? Vis-a-vis Russia. I mean, to imagine how brave JFK's stand on ending the Cold War was, you have to imagine if he were alive today trying to remind people that the Russians are people too, right? That's become, funny enough, that used to be a kind of a right-wing talking point, that the Russians are coming, the Russians are coming, the Russians are coming. Now that's sort of gone around to the other pole. But I think that one of the most surprising things, and this relates to your question, I think one of the most surprising things we learned, for instance, about JFK was that he's not really the cold warrior that he's been painted as. Rather, he was, and this may be surprising to some people, he was a committed anti-colonialist, a committed anti-imperialist. Whether that imperialism emanated from the Soviets or from the Western powers. So, for instance, in the Senate in 1956, he stands up to make a speech against the French occupation, the French colonization, and the continued occupation of Algeria. What an incredibly brave thing to do. This angered the people at the Council on Foreign Relations and many others. He knew that the side of history was on people's self-determination, freedom, their sovereignty. He spoke in favor of African sovereignty in a way that people just don't realize. People have no idea that there were all these newly independent African nations, for instance. Northern Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, dozens of new countries were coming onto the world stage, having fought for and won their independence. Kennedy ran on the platform of chastising the Eisenhower administration for not doing anything to welcome these countries into the fold. When Kennedy got into office, well, even first as a senator, because, of course, conditions in Washington were still segregated, he became the go-to guy for African diplomats to help them find hotel rooms, okay? I mean, this is the kind of thing that JFK Senate office had to do. When he then got into office, he threw ticker tape parades and state dinners for the newly independent African leaders. When Patrice Lumumba, who he called the George Washington of the Congo, was assassinated, there's a famous picture taken of Kennedy with his head in his hands, feeling the agony of that event. The CIA, we now know, was deeply involved in that assassination. And they did it when they did it because they knew JFK was in support of Lumumba and was in support of Congolese independence from their Belgian masters and the corporate managers of all the incredible rich resources of the Congo. So throughout, I mean, he friends, whether that was with people and the people of Ghana, Tanganyika, you name it, he welcomed them and made overtures. He was an anti-imperialist. So I think that, and that extended to the Middle East. And I think that his efforts in the Middle East, if he had been allowed to continue through a second term, as Libby says, I think we'd see a much different picture. That whole area would be a much more settled place, and we would not see many of the conflicts that we've seen over the past 60 years there.
That's very interesting. One thing I wanted to mention as well, I noticed that Oliver Stone is in this documentary. That's one of the interviews that you've done. That one doesn't surprise me. I would imagine he would be in a documentary about this. He has strong opinions against the war industry as well. But also, I was surprised to see that RFK Jr. was in this documentary. And I say that not because, I mean, obviously there's two Kennedys that we're talking about here in reference to Four Died Trying. But I'm curious to get your opinion about this because RFK Jr., when he announced his campaign, he said he was running as a peace candidate. Then October 7th happened and we started to see, whoa, okay, he seems to not be a peace candidate after all, because he's saying on Twitter, give Israel everything that they need. What is your opinion about that? Considering that you interviewed him for this documentary, and I did read that JFK actually at one point in time when he was still alive, he actually did not want Israel to develop nuclear weapons. So that was an article that was released recently on Mint Press News. So I did read that recently. So it seems like a lot of the things that we've been told about JFK are obviously lacking. We're not told much about him when it comes to foreign policy, I think. Particularly in the educational system. But what is your take about this now? Considering where RFK Jr., the position that he's given in reference to Israel and the Palestinian people?
Libby, do you want to?
Twitter might not have done him a favor on his policy there. I heard him speak recently, and it's a very much longer, nuanced position that he's taking. It's not just give Israel everything they want by a long shot. And I think it's people have to listen to the whole thing. He didn't do himself a favor with a Twitter post like that. And the short venue of Twitter doesn't do his policy any favors. He really goes deep and talks about both sides of it and the problems that exist on both sides, where I think he comes down in a place where there should definitely be peace. And there's a lot of players that are at fault here. It's not just the Israelis. It's not just Hamas. It's not just, you got to look to the U.S. very, very much so for a lot that's gone on in the Middle East for all these years. So I think you can't boil it down that quickly and that easily.
Yeah, and RFK Jr., obviously we interviewed him first back in 2019 and again, well before the conflict in Gaza, the recent conflict in Gaza. But as an interview, he actually, I think, has been the one Kennedy who has been willing to really look at what happened to his father and uncle. It's an incredibly painful thing. Other Kennedy family members that we interviewed became, after all these years, even so visibly upset that they couldn't really address some of the questions. So, he was, when his father was assassinated, he was old enough to understand things that were happening. Only recently did he, in the past, I'd say 10, 15 years, did he come around to looking at some of the evidence himself. And that led to him, for instance, being in support of the release of Sirhan. He feels, as do most of the researchers, in fact, I think anyone who looks at the case, that Sirhan was not responsible for Bobby Kennedy Sr.'s death. The famous coroner, one of them who just died, Cyril Wecht, who was looked at the case along with his colleague, whose name I'm forgetting now. Thomas Noguchi. Thomas Noguchi lost his job saying that, in fact, Bobby Kennedy Sr. was shot from behind at close range. And of course, Sirhan was in front of Bobby and, at least 6 feet away. So, Bobby Kennedy Jr. has been very brave, looking at the issues that led to his uncle and father's deaths and looking at the particulars of his uncle and father's death. A few other Kennedys have as well, but he did that. It took us a long time to get that first interview in 2019, but he's looked at this in a way that's it's quite something, because they, many other people in the family are just like, even if they are in favor, for instance, of remediating prisons as they exist and releasing convicted murderers in other regards. They certainly are not in favor of releasing Sirhan or looking at the details that exonerate Sirhan. So that, in other words, where Bobby Kennedy may have all kinds of, positions that, we have Roger Stone in the film, we've got all kinds of people in the film who, whose political ideas we may or may not agree with, but they're in there because they have something important to offer about the story.
Well, one thing I do just want to push back on for just a second, but it goes actually further beyond Twitter. I've seen him in a number of interviews actually not give a nuanced position. Every interview I've seen RFK Jr. in discussing Israel and Gaza, he blames it all on the Palestinians. In fact, there was an interview that he had with Breaking Points where he referred to the Palestinian people as pampered. So I have not yet seen him give a nuanced position on this particular issue. So that's why I was kind of surprised that he was in this documentary, because I don't consider him to be a peace candidate or peaceful person as he claims to be.
Well, again, Libby's seen him speak recently. I have not followed his stance on Gaza very extensively. Again, there are all kinds of people in the film who don't necessarily represent the values of RFK and JFK. Some of the people in the film are literally people who hated JFK and RFK, right? We have anti-Castro Cuban, veterans of the Bay of Pigs who think Kennedy was either a coward or a traitor. So, they're not necessarily, we're definitely not all on the same page politically, but that, Roger Stone, I think he's become a different person in many ways, but I don't think I'm on the same page politically with Roger Stone, but he's in the film. So as I say, for us, there's not, a litmus test. And of course we did all this. We interviewed Bobby well before Gaza. So, we weren't going to cut him out because, he said X or Y. People can form their own opinions about what he says now, then, and later. People on the right attack Bobby because he says all kinds of, way too liberal things, going back many years. So everyone's going to have a problem with somebody, So anyway, yeah, we're just focused on the history of what happened, really, as opposed to today.
Another thing I want to bring up too, again, for those who are just joining, Four Died Trying documentary here about JFK, Malcolm X, MLK, and Bobby Kennedy. When it comes to Malcolm X, I think a lot of times people they may not think of Malcolm X when we talk about war or imperialism, but Malcolm X was actually very much against these wars, very much against the conflict abroad. And I think a lot of times it's just not brought up, particularly even in the educational system in school. They don't really bring this up, that he was against that as well.
And in fact, he kind of picks up where JFK leaves off because of the assassination, and is working with the all the leaders of the newly independent African nations to bring charges against the U.S. and the International Court of Law for racism. And it's one of the things that scared the powers that be about him. There was kind of a ticking time clock on Malcolm's life because the Big Bandung Conference was coming up, and he was joining all these African leaders together, and they were going to become a powerful force against U.S. imperialism. And that was definitely one of the reasons he, as we say, had to go. And he even had an office at the UN. He was really working it hard. And he is as I said earlier, he comes out against the war in Vietnam very, very early 60s, when nobody is saying boo about the war in Vietnam. He is.
Yeah, no, he is a very sophisticated and complex figure with a deep humor, a deep understanding of the world. And as he goes out on his own, funny enough, because of comments that he made over the Kennedy assassination, when he goes out on his own, he really is freed to speak and to go out into different worlds that he would not have gone out into as if he stayed in the Nation of Islam. So, for instance, we've got clips of him giving an incredible performance at the Oxford Union, where he's just reeling off long sections of Hamlet as part of his argument about why we live in a time where extreme measures are called for to deal with the extremism of the powers that be. So, and he, and that's in that address says, you know, I don't care what color you are, as long as you're trying to end the horrible situation that the world is in, if you're going to work with me on that. So as soon as people start unifying as opposed to dividing, whether that's on race lines, or, you know, you're a red state person, or you're a deplorable, you're a liberal, the powers that be love that. They love to keep us divided as Republican and Demoblicon. They love to keep us divided in ways that where we don't see any of our, the very many commonalities that we all have as we deal with, the war on us. If I can go back to the old title of our film, of a prior project. So that's what we have to resist, right? These efforts to make us, see our differences more than our commonalities. So that's something that, for instance, the left used to really understand, right? Especially when it came to, like, say, unionization. There was always the effort to split people along racial lines or ethnic lines. And, the unions had to overcome that to get people to realize, okay, we're all workers here. And that the same goes for us as citizens and just, humans. We need to see that we have so much more in common than they would have us believe. And that's how they win, is when we're fighting each other.
Another thing that's interesting too, again, with all four of these men in the war in Vietnam, I'm thinking about comparisons today, right? So the war in Vietnam, this was the last time they actually showed war coverage on national television, right? So after the war in Vietnam, the media said, no, we cannot show war coverage on national television again, because a lot of Americans were getting really upset, right? Like the soldiers that came back from Vietnam oftentimes weren't praised, from what I understand. They were called baby killers, et cetera. So Americans actually got to see that and add the draft to that. But Americans actually got to see that there were all these civilians overseas that were being killed. So it was not shown on national television anymore. But fast forward to today, where social media becomes into play, right? So a lot of us, I think, we have seen what has happened in Gaza. We've seen what's happened between Russia and Ukraine. Like, we've been able to see video footage on social media. So that has surpassed mainstream media. So I see a lot of comparisons between, like, Vietnam and Gaza. That being considered, why do you think more people today, considering what happened to those four, why do you feel more people today feel a little bit more empowered to be vocal about being anti-war and speaking out against these wars?
It's an interesting question. I mean, in some measure, the protests against the Vietnam War are what led to the powers that be deciding that they would never allow journalists again out in the field to cover war. They did. The Vietnam War, if you look at some of the great war correspondents who covered that and were responsible for turning the tide, the tide of the American view. So you had Sidney Schamberg, and you had David Halberstam, and you had Neil Sheehan, and you had all these reporters who they went out and they showed you what was happening. And in fact, Sony was asked to come up with very specific film cameras that were cheaper, because the crews would be out in the fields and they would start being under attack, and they would just drop their really expensive cameras and run. And so it was beginning to cost a lot of money. So I think that showing the war is what helped fuel the protests. And also, as soon as the draft ended, the protests also ended. So we see it.
Go ahead.
We see it now, and as when people see it, it becomes a visceral reaction to war, and we don't want to.
Yeah. But I think today the only way that any of these conflicts end, including the proxy war in Ukraine, which NATO has a lot to do with starting, is if we were serious about it, we would do war tax resistance. So in other words, it's one thing to sort of set up a tent city in a college or something, and turn this into the divisive thing that it's turned into, and nobody really on the left is looking critically at the U.S. involvement in the Ukraine-Russia situation. But the only way that these things would end is if we did massive non-compliance with war taxes. So that once we're serious about this, that's what people will do. I mean, in other words, the powers that be don't care if people are yelling on a college campus. They're happy to let that happen. You can blow off steam all you want. They don't give a damn. They just, they'll roll right over it. And the reason why they got rid of the draft, of course, and turned it into economic conscription, is because when you had the draft, you were taking from too many strata of society, people, who were from the middle class, more in a position to object. And, you formed hardcore resistance. As soon as they took away the draft, the real war resistance, the real critical analysis of the war machine disappeared in this country. So that's why the military-industrial complex was allowed to continue to metastasize through 9/11 and everything else that we see, to keep the tension in the Middle East at a high boil. I mean, in other words, all this benefits, the whole thing benefits the U.S. and international war machine, because after all, these corporations are international. So you couldn't have asked for it better. You could almost think that somebody paid Hamas to do October 6th and is happy that Russia invaded Ukraine, and all the rest of it is just about tension. The ruling class loves a state of tension. They want to keep things at a high boil. The more that there's chaos, famine, misery, and war, the more they can sell their products. I had a commodities trader say that to me, that the best friend of a commodities broker is war, pestilence, and famine.
Well, one of the things I've noticed too about these four is that we haven't really had someone like that since. Mm-hmm. We haven't had another JFK. We haven't had another. I think some of us thought Bernie was going to go down that road, but no, he seems to be in with the establishment as well. We haven't had a Malcolm X. We haven't had another MLK. We haven't had another Bobby Kennedy. And it's like, after those four were killed, there was never another voice to rise up and to take that place after that. It's something
Fred Hampton might have, but they killed him so young. Yep. Yeah. No, Libby, do you want to speak to that?
I mean, I think that they have found a way to keep that from happening, whether it was from assassination, so that those leaders did not grow into old age and then have proteges, whether it was from how they have manipulated the coverage of things, how they've manipulated the education system, the entertainment that we get fed. There's many factors that go into it. And after what happened with the protests and the war in Vietnam, you had the powers that be getting together and saying, this is never going to happen again.
Yeah,
they wanted to make sure that this never did happen again. And as John talked about, the fractionalization, don't let too many, as soon as you get two different kinds coming together to agree on something, they work very quickly to split it apart. They don't want too much coming together of too many disparate groups of people. And so they work very hard to make sure you don't get those kind of voices again. And look at the cover, look at how we get our news today. So social media also means we're very fractionalized. It's harder to bring everybody together with a central voice, because you're watching over here and I'm watching over here and John's watching over here. And maybe there's not a lot of overlap, because we're also picking what we like. So we're no longer getting
a curated stream,
even if it's not the best curated stream in the world. We don't get things anymore that we're not interested in. And suddenly, how many in the old days, I remember looking at a newspaper and I'd be reading and I'd be on a page and for some reason I got stuck on that page and I wouldn't have read the article on the bottom, but there I was, and suddenly I'm reading about something I would never have purposely picked to read about.
Yeah, well, that's part of all this. I think part of what, to your question about why we haven't seen others is of their caliber. I mean, first of all, they're just rare beings. Coretta has said that about Dr. King. I mean, they were really a hard act to follow, as Bob Dylan sings in Murder Most Foul about John Kennedy. I think that one of the factors, along with many that Libby mentioned, and the sort of, because I think first of all, there's a general unconscious statement that this is what happens. I think there's a reason these men were publicly killed the way they were, right? It sends a message to everybody else. But I would say that we as a country, and by extension the world, but really as a country in particular, we have not we have not addressed how and why these men were killed. We have not really taken a look at it. And I think if we were to do that, people might be, might take heart, first of all, as painful as it is, because it is painful to look at, to realize, the state, the government that we look to for protection, or, that anything can happen. It's like there are a lot of prominent intellectuals on the left, like Noam Chomsky, for instance, who will not look at the Kennedy assassination, or really any of these assassinations, or at events like 9/11. They won't address the evidence that shows government involvement. And even though they're happy to look at government involvement in various atrocities around the world, they somehow, this is a bridge too far, and they will not go there. And that's a shame, because if we could see, if people could understand, oh, this is what Kennedy was doing, and here's how he was, for instance, trying to better the lot of the middle class and working class, and here's how he went up against the steel companies, and here's how he was trying to end the CIA, and this is what he felt needed to happen, and here's how he was trying to simmer down the tensions between the US and Russia. If we saw that, and even though he died for it, we'd say, you know what, these were the right things to be doing, and these are the things we still need to do, and it's worth risking your life to do them. And that's the other thing. It's like, if it gets diffused, it's like people are like, oh, Kennedy, he wasn't actually that good on civil rights, and he slept with all these women, and that's all people kind of maybe know. And they don't realize, oh, wow, wait a second, no, this guy was super brave and doing incredibly radical things, and and that there's so much in common with him and say Malcolm, both of whom were reaching out to newly independent African leaders, for instance. It's just, it's quite extraordinary. Or MLK. We sit there and we talk about, the I Have a Dream speech, and all of that is quite wonderful. But the fact that in the last year of his life, he after he makes the Riverside Church speech, April 4th, 1967, he comes out against the Vietnam War in what is really his best speech. And a year to the day later, he's dead. He's killed. He's shot. Now, that whole year where he's trying to bring all the different races together to occupy Washington until Congress does something about poverty, that is an incredible thing. That is an example that should be followed. That's the kind of thing we need to do and think about, as opposed to getting like hung up on, oh, is the country, whatever, run by deplorables, or what's happening? No, we need to get together and deal with those big issues that affect us all. That's what King was doing, and that's why they killed him. So they need to hide that. There's only been one major documentary about, on HBO. It sort of addressed the last year of King's life. All the rest of it is just about the very particular civil rights years. None of it really focuses on his planned Poor People's Campaign and his defiance, his objection to the Vietnam War. So this is about, they killed him twice in a way. There's the first assassination, and then they knock the halo off their heads. We get, oh, King was, we see some notes were revealed from the FBI where we see King was witness to a rape and he was laughing. I mean, it's just smearing the character of these guys, and no one again addresses what they died for and why it was so important that they knew they would risk their lives for it, and that's in fact what we should do.
Well said there. Well, Ford died trying. When does this premiere, and where can people watch it?
So they can watch the prologue right now on Amazon, Apple, YouTube, and various other platforms. You can watch chapter 1, which deals with the Red Scare and the Cold War, the period leading up to Kennedy's inauguration, by becoming a Patreon member. It's available exclusively to our Patreon members, and we will be releasing. We're dealing with all kinds of issues right now, including maybe suppression by platforms like Amazon. But if people sign up for Patreon, then they'll be the first to see new chapters as they come out. So, the chapter after chapter 1, chapter 2 is going to focus on what I was talking about, Kennedy's anti-colonialism, this incredible relationship he had with Africa and the newly independent African leaders. It's going to focus on his Irish heritage, which is why he has this incredible anti-colonial sense, because he comes from a people that were under colonial domination for over 800 years. So he has a very visceral sense of that anti-colonial feeling, and that's going to be in chapter 2. So Patreon, so the prologue is available right now on Amazon and Apple, and through our website fourdiedtrying.com, and then you can go on Patreon, see chapter 1, which is all about the military-industrial complex and the Red Scare, and then you'll be signed up to get the new chapters as they come out.
Awesome. Thank both of you so much. Eric, if you can put the link to that site in the chat. But thank you, John, and thank you, Libby, so much for coming on.